All right, back real quick here at the Moxie Meeting Promotions table, being joined, unscheduled autograph or interview session here today. Caught up with the 2016 Willamette Speedway Sportsman Track Champion, Sandy Sanders, a guy who has had a stellar career that's lasted decades. I know it's a guy that I've watched race literally my whole life, and pictures on my wall of the old Corvette with the sprint car wing on top.
Yeah, that brings back some memories. One of the first races we won there actually was in about 72 in a 57 Chevrolet.
Well, like I said, I've watched you race my whole life. I wasn't even born in 72, Sandy.
Yeah, I believe it.
But, let's talk about your racing career, because you've kind of been a guy that, you've always been competitive, no matter what class or what type of race car you've been in. You've been at Willamette Speedway, Cottage Grove, Eugene Speedway. You're not afraid to travel. You've been at all these tracks. You've seen success everywhere. But you claimed the championship this year at 2016 at Willamette Speedway against a very tough field of sportsman cars.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. We don't generally run for championships. We've never have, actually. I've never actually won a championship. We've run competitively almost all the time, but last year I decided if I was ever going to win one, I better get her done.
Well, and talking, prior to the interview now, the broadcast, prior to that, talking about that, I was surprised to learn that's your first championship.
Yeah, well, I get that from a lot of people. They assume that I have won championships, but I never actually made the effort in time and money that it takes to do that. I really respect these guys that race there all the time. Kind of blows me away. I like more family stuff, and I love to go hunting, so in September, basically, I'm usually gone hunting. So that's kind of the way I've always kind of done things. Racing's great, and it's been a major part of my life, and at some point I'm going to have to give it up, but I ain't ready yet.
Well, anybody who knows you well, they knows that you love to hunt and fish. You are a family guy. Took the family over to Kona just recently and had some time in Hawaii, but hunting and fishing may have been responsible in costing you a couple championships, because I know back in the, I'd say, late 70s, early to mid 80s, you finished second at Willamette Speedway twice to the great Don Wilson. Let's kind of talk about those days and kind of the evolution of your career and the cars that have come along since then.
Yeah, it's I just kind of fell into the love of racing at an early age. It was kind of odd because none of my family were racers. Nobody in my family were gearheads at all. My dad only ever went to one race ever. And it was so noisy and nasty and dirty, he couldn't believe I was going to be doing that. So anyway, I didn't come by it from a family thing. I just had a natural thing for it, and I loved it. I actually started racing at Cottage Grove way back when with a couple of friends of mine. I wasn't driving. I was just helping on their car. That was where the original Avengers racing team developed. Fred Delanco and Leroy Barnett were two good buddies of mine. One of them's passed away now. But back in those days, they raced what they called a modified, but it's not like today's modified. They were all open wheel race cars that were pretty much hand built.
Kind of the old hard top almost type deal from the late 50s carried into the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. 60s is kind of where I started out there. And I never actually drove a race car until, actually the very first race car, now that I think about it, there was a small dirt track over at Siletz, Oregon. I hope hardly anybody knows that. And it only lasted there for 2 or 3 years. And it was just more of a little track that was cut out of a cow pasture. And a bunch of guys just got together with their old jalopies, and we decided to go racing. And that's what we did. And that's how I got the initial bug.
So you mentioned the Avengers racing team that started way back in. Approximately what year was that?
Probably about 66 would be and maybe even a little bit. Yeah, about 66. I was probably a senior in high school, and that's about right.
Because earlier I mentioned, your career has spanned literally decades, and you've found success in all those decades. And you've ran against so many great drivers that have come out of the Northwest. I mean, from Tex Jackson to Jay Bugby, Don Wilson, Mark Howard, even into the guys that have just recently retired, Russ Sell, Bob Jeffrey, Tom Wagner. You've ran against all these guys, and you've had success against those guys, even in your later career in the sportsman class, just picking up the championship. But you did it. This is what's interesting, and I didn't know this until we started talking, but the Avenger chassis that you run, now I understand where that name comes from and why you use it.
Yeah, it was actually developed. The buddies that I was associated with, we just kind of put it on the car one day as a lark, and it just kind of developed from then. We became the Avengers racing team.
Well, so when you debuted the first Avenger chassis that I remember seeing goes back to almost the dirt modified style from you see in the big blocks in the Northeast, where you sat in the middle of the car with the wedge nose and the big sideboard and the no top. You brought that car out and people thought, what is he doing? What is that thing? And it worked. The car was fast. That's back in the old outlaw rules where we still ran the big 65-inch sideboards and the 83-inch wide bodies, outlaw racing at Willamette Speedway. To kind of see you take that and apply that knowledge of what you've done as a hobbyist, I guess, chassis builder. I know you're one of those guys that's creative, like to do your own thing, and to find a championship in your own car, that's got to be pretty satisfying.
Yeah, my whole career really hinged around not just the driving part of it. I totally immersed myself in the concept of different types of suspensions, and I'm pretty well versed in how suspensions work and how they're supposed to work. And I love the fabrication part of it. So if I can kind of think along a little bit different plane, that's what I go for. And it's not always successful. I mean, you mentioned that the center seat wedge car. Well, it worked really, really good when the track had any kind of grip, but I built the chassis too stiff, and it wouldn't work so well on a dry slick. So what would happen is we'd qualify real well, and fasten trophy dashes and all that, and go towards the front. But then as the track dried out, that car would invariably start backing up. So you learn stuff from that.
But you're one of those guys that have taken that knowledge and have applied it, and you put it in the memory bank, and you know what does what. We've seen you do over the decades. We've seen you do some very innovative things, and in fact, going back to some of my earliest memories of the racetrack, it was Don Wilson and his number 5 Nova, and you in the old 43 Corvette with those rent car wings. I mean, that was, back then, it was the norm. And then we kind of kept going that direction while the rest of the country evolved, and we had these outlaw rules out here under Claire Arnold at Willamette Speedway, and now we're starting to see the evolution, the last 10 years into what the rest of the country's doing. But what kind of racing does Sandy Sanders prefer, and what kind of race car would you rather be in?
Well, I prefer stuff that I'm doing right now, mostly because the technology that's required, I mean, I'd love to have a late model, even though I probably wouldn't be able to drive it really competitively for any more than maybe 10 or 15 laps. I just don't have what it takes to run 40 laps at that kind of speed anymore. But that's not to say that I wouldn't love trying. But the technology that's behind that stuff, I mean, to me, it's gone way beyond what I'm going to want to do at this point in my life. But now, if you're not a shock expert and are willing to invest $3,000 or $4,000 in a set of shocks, you're not going to go anywhere.
It's interesting you say that, because we've done multiple interviews this weekend with Darren Koffel, Joey Tanner, Doug Davenport, and others, and shocks have come up in every single interview. And that really has been, just in the last 5, 6, 7 years, that's been the biggest technological advance under these race cars, is the shock packages and what you're seeing. Remember the old days when you wanted to change a shock, you jacked the car up, you pulled the shock off, you took the spring off and the cups, and you had to measure everything out and put it back together. Now you walk to the car and you simply a couple clicks on the dial, and it changes the whole race car. That's been the biggest deal. Now, on the sportsman cars that you run, the rules package, they're designed to keep the cars low cost and competitive. Okay? You guys are running on the asphalt slick tires on a dirt track. You got to be a driver to win onto those tires, because you got some horsepower under you still. You're still in a race car, a fabricated race chassis with some decent suspension. It's got to be a 3-point suspension. But making a 3-point suspension work with the shocks that you're allowed to use and the tires under you, that's a challenge in itself.
Yeah, it is, and that's it's more suited to me. I mean, when I decided, well, the reason I got out of the late model stuff originally, well, one is it was just not cost effective for me anymore, and then I could see what was happening on the shock program, and at that point, I kind of struggled for a while to see whether I wanted to invest in the knowledge that it was going to take to go that route. And at that point in my career, I decided it was time to start backing up. So, and I didn't have a problem doing that. I just go ahead and get a modified and played with that for a while. But and that's good. I'm building a modified right now, and I'll probably have them not modified next year. But this going with the old packages with the 3-link and the slicks, and that's kind of like in my wheelhouse. So that's what I was raised at, and that's what I learned at. And Don Wilson was my mentor pretty much through those early years, and he's the one that taught me most of that stuff.
Well, to have Don Wilson as a mentor at any time in your career is that's a pretty good bragging right to have, because Don was known simply as the best. The Coburg Charger, he multiple championships at multiple tracks. I mean, the guy was a real talent. So to learn from him, that I probably put one heck of a foundation underneath you. Now, that chassis that you built, the Avenger, that car started off originally as a modified that you ran against the IMCA modified rules packages, and then decided to back it off as a Sportsman. Interesting note on that is the track record holder in your division at Willamette Speedway, Tom Yak, also converted a modified to the Sportsman package, and we're seeing those cars work really, really well with the 3-point underneath them on those big slick tires.
Oh yeah, no, they're very competitive. They get right with it. Yax is a very fast car. There's a lot of good cars in that class, and I expect this year you're going to see more of the. Well, after they've seen what Tom and I were doing with them with the old modified chassis under them, you'll probably see a lot of that this year.
I don't doubt that. I mean, we've heard some chatter throughout the winter of other guys converting some of those cars that they're maybe just a little too old to run against some of the newer technology in the modified class, and dropping down to the Sportsman, putting the Sportsman bodies on them, and being competitive. And that's a great thing about dirt track racing, is you can take a car that's 10 years old and still put it in victory lane in multiple classes based upon rule packages.
Oh yeah, I mean, my car, it started out as a modified, but and that was, I guess I built that about 6 years ago. But in today's modified market, it's too big and too heavy. I mean, that car's with me in it's about 2650. And the mods now, they're building them so feather light and then adding the weight where they want to. So it makes a big difference. But it's a natural fit in that Sportsman class. And I really like to see more and more guys come into that.
And I think you're going to see that because, number one, you can take that car that, like I said, that they didn't feel that they were a top competitive car, drop it down a class, be super competitive, and not spend what they have to spend to run a modified. That's the great thing about the Sportsman class. As a race fan or a racer, dollar for dollar, I think at your racetrack, you race at Willamette Speedway, I think as a fan or a driver, that's the class that gives you the most bang for your buck, entertainment-wise, and being a racer and being competitive.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And I truly believe that particular class and the classics is where that track needs to develop its field, because back in the day, we had an A, B, and a C, and sometimes a D in that Sportsman division, and that's where those young drivers come up. You got to get Grandma and Grandpa sitting up there in the stands watching little Johnny going down around that track in a little classic car, and they're going to say, well, we got to get you faster, boy. So then they step him up to a Sportsman, and then that kid, he develops the desire for it, and everybody that you put on the track in a car brings 2 or 3 grandmas and grandpas up there, and they're the ones that are going to fund that car. So to me, those classes are at least as important as any class out there. They may not be as exciting to watch as far as compared to a late model, but that's what builds that track in the past.
Well, you talk about the exciting, and I think dollar for dollar, the Sportsman and the street stocks really provide some world-class racing in the fact that they race just as... They're not going as fast, I'll give you that, but they're still racing door handle to door handle. They'll put a bumper on each other, and it's fun to watch. I mean, those guys really put on a heck of a show when there's 16, 18 of them on the track, but, that's the late model world. You talk about the high dollar, the super fast cars, 900 horsepower, and backing it in, and the street stocks and the classics. I know those guys they'll go side by side 4 wide, and you don't see a lot of that in the late model class.
Yeah, it's a great class. I mean, almost everybody in there you have the full range. You got the young kids coming up that are trying to learn a little bit, and you got guys like me that are on the way back down.